Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now these days most graphics cards ship with GDDR5 memory as standard, with some budget orientated GPUs still featuring DDR3. Some cheap cards even offer a choice between both different types of memory, though GDDR5 is generally the way to go, especially for gaming. Take for example the HD 7750. Not the main subject of today's video, but a good example of how the same card can vary in performance depending on the type of VRAM used. In the Unigine Heaven benchmark, a 1GB GDDR5 7750 will average about 30 frames per second, whereas a 2GB DDR3 card running the same in-test settings averaged just 23. As I said before though, unless you're shopping around at the very cheap end of the market, you won't have to think about observing and comparing that distinction, with any one of today's popular mid-range GPUs using GDDR5 as standard. But it hasn't always been this way, and just like anything, there would have been a time when tech, now so commonplace, once seemed so revolutionary. So let's take a trip down memory lane all the way back to the June of 2008, a time when Crysis was still being used as the ultimate benchmark test, and us PC gamers were anxiously awaiting any news regarding the now infamous GTA 4 PC port. Late that June, AMD released what was the very first GDDR5 graphics card, the Radeon HD 4870. With a launch price of $299 the 4870 was based on the same RV770 GPU as its then week-old baby brother, the 4850, yet that one shipped with slower GDDR3, which in turn offered only half the bandwidth. The 4870 was a pretty special card then, essentially paving the way for the new normal. You long-time viewers out there may remember we took a look back at the 4870X2, the dual GPU version of this card a while ago, and managed to get it working very briefly using the old oven method, as it was a broken card that one of you guys sent in. I believe I mentioned then of some of the limitations of such a card, which apply of course to the earlier and single version of it as well, the main one being the lack of modern DirectX support. Nonetheless, that hasn't stopped us before, so let's take a look back at the performance of this old thing and celebrate what made it great. So I've conducted a few in-game tests of titles that will run on this DirectX 10.1 compatible graphics card, starting of course with the aforementioned and once very demanding Crysis. I've used a mixture of settings throughout today, but I have tried to keep the resolution the same most of the time, where the games allowed it of course. Crysis 1080p mixed settings averaged 40 frames per second, which was pretty respectable. We're off to a pretty good start here, and I played through the first opening couple of levels as usual, and the game held up pretty well. There will be a few frame drops below 30 FPS, but all in all, it was an okay experience. CSGO, and I tried to target 60 frames per second, which was actually quite easy. 1080p resolution once again, a mixture of settings, though of course CSGO is certainly more CPU intensive, so bear that in mind when using a graphics card like this. I used a mixture of low, very low and medium settings here, and like I say, performance wise it did pretty well for itself, I think. Now the newest title I tried today was actually Fortnite. Now this was quite a surprise to see it running at 720p, albeit with the low and medium settings. 44 frames per second was the average here, again quite surprising. Some may consider this unplayable due to the number of frame drops that I experienced here. There will be a few stutters and a total loss in performance in some instances, but for the majority of the time it was an okay experience. Of course, an online competitive shooter like this one does sort of rely on you to have pretty fast reactions in the face of other players, so you may consider it unplayable if there's a lot of stuttering going on. Next up we tested Grand Theft Auto 4, again another demanding and pretty infamous PC port, here though at 1080p with a mixture of settings, sort of between medium and high. We saw 37 frames per second. This was again better than I thought it was going to be. There were some pretty huge frame drops here and there, but even on my modern Ryzen 5 1600 and GTX 1070 system, I do still see some pretty significant dips, I have to say, and it has nothing to do with hardware. It's just the way the game is designed to run on PC. It isn't exactly the best PC port in the world. Modern Warfare 2 I've been really getting into again lately, the successor to the popular Call of Duty 4 of course. 1080p here with a mixture of settings, and the game had no trouble with sticking pretty close to that 60 FPS target. The Call of Duty series are hardly the most graphically demanding in the world, as you know, so I'm not surprised that we were able to hit pretty close to 60 frames per second on average throughout this opening level, as well as a little bit of multiplayer. Multiplayer though on Modern Warfare 2 now is pretty much ruined. There's loads of hackers, stuff like that, but you know, it's still a fun single player campaign. Last and anything but least, we have the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, the game that seems to have found its way to platforms that haven't even been released yet. 1080p, a mixture of settings once again, and we saw an average of 50 frames per second. Don't forget this game came out in about 2013, I believe, and at the time the card would have only been 4 or 5 years old, so it's no surprise that this one runs pretty well. All in all then, for your older games collection, the 4870 does pretty well. So you won't be running many modern titles due to the lack of DirectX 11 support. As for this video though, well, I hope you've enjoyed a little look back at what was the first GDDR5 graphics card to ever release. If you did, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know if you've ever owned this card down below in the comments. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.